On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards this stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what, I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor-trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out, and she rushed over to the truck, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down, and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately loads of sightings were reported of Juan, but every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found. He's still missing, and his case is... In 2007, Barbara Bullock was a 55-year-old, fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hike. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, "I'd still like to go." And so he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time, and she had been with Jim, so where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer, and he just told him, "You should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened." When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out, and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic, and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up, and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail, and she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around, and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around, expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked. And so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment. But he didn't, and he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks, and he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. And he got all the way to the parking lot, and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. And he's looking around the parking lot, she's not out there, and he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail, and they said no. And so Jim's starting to panic, and he ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so he ran right back down again, and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs, but nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play. There was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing. Not even her scent was found, despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was. But none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story despite how far-fetched it seemed, and he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara. On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leila and Raymond attended this festival basically every year, and so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leila's son, Hal, had tried to persuade Leila to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leila said no because Leila and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leila had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leila and Raymond's favorite song came to an end, and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic. And at that point, Raymond and Leila, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leila and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leila helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leila took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leila fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leila's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leila and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leila and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late, and so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leila had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over, and so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock, but when there was no answer, he thought, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leila and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was, but as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leela and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds, there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leela and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing, I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leela and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leela and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. You know, they checked their phone records, and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate, and it came back as belonging to Leela and Raymond. But you got to remember that this police officer was in Arkansas, and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leela and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leela and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leela and Raymond. Leela's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leela, hey, you're driving with your lights off. And Leela would say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. You know, we were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry. The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake, and so he just flicked her lights on and said, I'm going to give you a warning, no big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night. And Leela said, thank you very much. You know, of course, I'll be very careful with my lights. And then actually the officer gave Leela directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas, and then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leela and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Leela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But the reason this story is in this video is because this story about Leela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. But where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory. In 1910, 23-year-old Orville Tuttle worked as a locomotive engineer in Whitehall, Montana. While he loved his job and loved cars, his real passion was hunting. His friends would describe him as being a fearless hunter, a crack shot, and very cool under pressure. In October of that year, Orville, along with his younger brother and his cousin, headed off to a river valley just outside of Yellowstone National Park to do some hunting. When they got there, they made their way into the forest, they found a decent clearing, they brushed off some snow, and they set up their campsite. They stayed up for a bit around the campfire that night, but everybody went to bed early. The following morning, Orville was the first one to wake up, and while he was outside of the campsite, he noticed some elk tracks that had passed by in the night. And so he woke up his brother and cousin and told them he was going to go and track this animal for no longer than about an hour. The two men said that was fine. They knew Orville was a very accomplished outdoorsman, and so they weren't worried about him. An hour later, the brother and the cousin were now awake, and they were sitting around the fire waiting for Orville to return, but he didn't. The men waited another hour, and another hour, and another hour, and still Orville never showed up. And this whole time, the men are considering, should we go out and go looking for him? And every time they'd stand up to go begin their search, they'd say, you know what? I'm sure he's fine. We're overreacting. And they'd sit back down again. But by nightfall, when they still had not seen Orville or heard from him, the pair was starting to get really nervous. And so they decided they would go to bed, and Orville was bound to turn up in the middle of the night. Early the next morning, the two men got up hoping to see Orville, but he had not returned. And so the two men left the forest. They got two more family members to come back with them, and then the four of them began a search for Orville. And very quickly, they found Orville's tracks leading out of the camp, meandering their way through this very thick forest and through all the snow, all the way down to this very shallow river that at its deepest point was no higher than your ankle. Orville's tracks stopped at the edge of this river and continued for 3 miles, walking away from the campsite right alongside this river until they stopped in this little clearing in the snow where there was a very small campfire set up. But the logs and the kindling in the campfire had not been burned. And so the search party figured that Orville, when he got here, must have had wet matches or something because he couldn't get the fire going. And then from the campfire, they continued to follow Orville's tracks a little bit farther down the river until they turned and walked directly into this very shallow river. And then from there, the search party looked for miles and miles and miles downstream and upstream, and they never found any tracks leaving the river, even though alongside the entire river on both sides was plenty of snow. So anybody who walked into the river and then walked out again would leave tracks. But there were no more tracks. As it started to get dark and they still had not found any sign of Orville, one of the men left the forest and contacted authorities, who launched a formal search. The sheriff's department, along with hundreds of volunteers, descended into this area where Orville got lost, and they started by searching even farther downstream and upstream of this river to see if they could find where Orville stepped out of the river, but they too couldn't find any tracks. And so for a couple of days, they searched this river and the surrounding forest, but there was just no sign of Orville. Then on the third evening of this search, one of the searchers was up in the mountains in an area that was relatively close to the last area where Orville had tracks in the snow. And the searcher saw there was a little campfire that had been set up in the middle of nowhere. He walked up to it and he saw it had been recently extinguished. It was still warm, and next to this fire was a pair of boots. But there was no person anywhere in the vicinity. And then the searcher noticed there were tracks leaving this campfire, and these tracks were made with bare feet. And so the searcher just began following these tracks. And so the searcher went up a mountain, he went down the other side, down into this deep ravine, and then he stopped because he's looking straight ahead of him, and it's another mountain going straight up, and that's where the tracks continue to go. And it's very thickly forested, and it's starting to get dark. And so he's thinking to himself, is it a good idea to just continue walking on my own? or should I go back and get some help? And so as he's weighing out what he should do next, he catches movement out of his peripheral vision, and he kind of glances up into the mountain right ahead of him, and he sees this dark figure kind of slowly moving up the mountain quite a ways away from him. But from his perspective, even though he doesn't have a good view, it looks like a man. And so if it's a man walking up this hill, it's probably the same guy that left that campfire and therefore is leaving these barefoot tracks up this mountain. And so the searcher thinks that's gotta be Orville. Something's wrong with him. Who knows what's going on with him, but I gotta get his attention. And so the searcher yells out to this guy to try to get him to stop. But even though he was clearly in earshot, this guy just did not stop moving. He just methodically continued moving up the mountain. And so the searcher's confused at why this person wouldn't stop. And so he pulls out his pistol and fires 3 shots into the air, which is like the universal stop what you're doing and turn around. But again, this figure, this person, this guy didn't stop. They didn't react, no flinching. They just kept moving up and over the top of the mountain and out of sight. And so now the searcher's thinking to himself, what did I just see? Who is that? What were they doing out here? And he's thinking, you know what? It's too dark. I can't just continue up this mountain towards whoever this is. I gotta go back. And so the searcher marked where he was, turned around, and he ran back to the search party, and he told them what he had seen. And they said, okay, well, we'll go looking tomorrow. And so the next morning early, this huge search party gets to that ravine where he marked that spot. But at this point, so much snow had fallen, all the tracks of this barefoot man who was walking around the night before have all been covered up. And so despite doing a very extensive search with a lot of people in that area, they couldn't find any trace of this shoeless man. Many believe the shoeless man was Orville. And in fact, the local newspapers at the time speculated as much. But if it was Orville, why didn't he turn around when someone was yelling his name or when multiple gunshots were fired into the air? And where was he going walking barefoot in a snowstorm in the middle of the night? Others have speculated this was not Orville, that it was some other person or some other creature lurking around the woods at night, and that perhaps they had something to do with whatever happened to Orville. But regardless of who or what that figure was, no one ever found any traces of Orville or the shoeless man ever. Late one afternoon in April of 2019, a middle-aged woman named Mary was cutting up some vegetables in her kitchen in northern Spain when she heard a knock on her front door. So she put her things down, she went to the door, opened it up, and standing there was her next door neighbor, who was all smiles, and she was holding this big box that was wrapped in wrapping paper and had a big bow on it, and then sitting on top of this big gift was a tray of deep-fried rolls, or croquettes. Mary's neighbor was a 61-year-old woman named Carmen Marino, who was an exceptional chef, and her specialty were making these croquettes. They were filled with different types of meat and other things, and all the time, Carmen would come over and give them to Mary, and Mary loved these croquettes. And so as soon as she saw those, she was like, wow, amazing, and she invited Carmen inside. But Carmen didn't come inside. Instead, she took the croquettes and handed them to Mary, and Mary's like, okay, great, thank you. But Carmen was still standing right outside holding this box, and now Mary's looking at her thinking that Carmen looks kind of uneasy. And so Mary said, what's going on here? What's up with this box? Carmen was silent for a second and just kind of held this box out, at which point Mary realized, okay, so she's trying to give me this gift. And so Mary reached out and took this huge present, and she was like, thank you, Carmen. Like, what is this? What's going on? And Mary, when she looked at Carmen, she could tell Carmen's face was now bright red. She was very embarrassed about something, maybe whatever she was going to say. And so Mary just waited for Carmen to speak. And so eventually she would clear her voice, and then she would say, Mary, this is really embarrassing, but I need you to hold on to this box for a little bit. It contains my sex toys, and I'm having company over at my house, and I'm just worried that somehow they're gonna find these things. Mary was so caught off guard by what Carmen was telling her that she just started laughing. But Carmen didn't join in on the laughter. She just kind of looked down like she was totally mortified. Mary stopped laughing because she felt bad, and then Carmen kind of elaborated on why she had this huge box full of sex toys. She would tell Mary that, she bought them with the intent of using them with her boyfriend, but a couple of months ago he had broken up with her. But Carmen had held on to these in the hopes that the boyfriend would eventually take her back and they would get back together again and get to use these toys. And so even though this was a totally weird and kind of uncomfortable request, Mary kind of felt bad for Carmen. One, because she had to make this request of Mary, but also two, it was obvious that Carmen was pretty shaken up about, losing her boyfriend. And so Mary said, you know what? No problem, Carmen. I will look after your sex toys and I will enjoy your croquettes. And Carmen was so relieved and said, thank you so much. And then she turned and hustled back to her house. And then Mary shut the door and she brought the croquettes into the kitchen and she tried one and it was so good. And then she took the big box of sex toys and she went into the hallway. She opened up a closet and she put it on the top shelf and then shut the door. Over the next couple of days, Mary expected Carmen to come back over and reclaim her box of sex toys. But Carmen didn't. And when days turned into weeks and then turned into months, and still Carmen had not come over to get the sex toys, Mary was kind of annoyed, but she was just too embarrassed to go over to Carmen and be like, hey, why don't you come over and get your sex toys? And so Mary just decided she would leave it alone and not talk about it. And if ever Carmen wanted them back, she could have them. But if she never asked for them again, Mary didn't care. She would just eventually throw the box away, and that would be it. A few months later, on September 29th, 2019, so we're talking about 6 months or so from when the sex toys were first brought over to Mary's house, well, on this day, Mary was kind of doing chores in her house when she began to smell a really bad smell coming from the hallway closet where the box of sex toys were. And so Mary opened up the closet, and for sure, she could tell the bad smell was coming from this closet. And so she started by smelling the shoes that were towards the bottom of the closet to see if maybe she had stepped in something gross, but they were all clean. And then eventually she reached the sex toy box. She pulled it down from the top shelf, and it had never been opened. It's still wrapped, but she just smelled the box and she immediately recoiled because that had to be where the terrible smell was coming from. It was coming from this box. And so Mary was totally repulsed at the idea that these sex toys smell horrible, but she carried the box into the kitchen and set it down, and she thought, is this a horrible betrayal of my friend's trust if I open up this box and look at her sex toys? But Mary ultimately was like, you know what? Carmen has not come back for this thing. I'm opening this up because I need to know what's making this smell. And so Mary went over and got a pair of scissors and she cut off the wrapping paper, and then she opened up the box, and inside was like this big thing that had been wrapped in tinfoil. So all you saw was tinfoil. And so Mary, she reached down and kind of began to peel back the tinfoil. It was kind of sticking to whatever was under it. But eventually, after she kind of yanked on it, she pulled the tinfoil off. And when she saw what was in there, she began screaming and ran outside and called the police. It would turn out Mary's neighbor, Carmen, who owned the box of sex toys, well, her boyfriend didn't just break up with her a couple of months before she brought the sex toys over. No, her boyfriend, who was a 67-year-old man named Jesus Baranda, he went missing around the time that supposedly Carmen and her boyfriend broke up. And so naturally, Jesus's family began looking for Jesus, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. And eventually the police called Carmen and said, hey, you were dating Jesus around the time he went missing. We're going to need to come to your house and search it. And when Carmen heard that, she knew she had a big problem, because Carmen had murdered Jesus and cut his head off with a chainsaw, and she still had his head in her house. And so what did she do? Well, she boiled his head down, and then she put it in a box, wrapped it in tinfoil, and then she wrapped that box in wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and then went next door to Mary's house and said, hey, can you hold my sex toys for me? Because she knew Mary would likely not look in the box if it was sex toys. And so Mary took the box, put it in her closet, and then of course, the smell began several months later, and she would discover Jesus's head. Carmen was convicted of murdering her boyfriend, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Police were never able to locate the rest of Jesus. All they had was his head. But there's a running theory that Carmen may have used the rest of her boyfriend's body and ground it up and then baked him into her croquettes that she gave out to people like Mary and other people in her neighborhood. But that's just a theory. On June 23, 1963, 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta mountain range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, but just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located, and at this point, his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet, and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him, and the child was Bruce, and Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw at night.